Okay, so I'm Ron Vidal. We're at the headquarters of Oppenheimer Company here, 300 Madison, Midtown New York, with our friends from RCR Wireless. We're streaming live today, and it'll be archived. Check out our website. You can get our links. This is the first of our Investing in Mobile Broadband series with a capital markets twist, and we've really been able to explore some topics in wireless that have kind of run the whole gamut from the most fixed part of the infrastructure, which is the towers, both in the United States and in Latin America and EMEA and around the world. We talked about changes in antenna design, architecture, macro cell, pico cell. How does the world adapt, and how do mobile network operators adapt to demand? What do we just heard a panel talk about new pricing models and cost structures and spectrum efficiency. And I thought a good way to kind of end it up here was to come right back to that network element that kind of caused all this to happen. And it's the thing that we all carry around in our pockets or in our briefcases or in our purses or in our cars. In fact, Chris here has one of the latest vintage of devices. But with me today, Chris Hare, who is the CEO of nTete Group, and joining us from Oppenheimer is Yair Reiner, who covers a whole bunch of stocks, including Apple, but has a pretty good handle on what's going on in the wireless infrastructure as well. So I want to thank these guys for carving. It sounds like both you guys have a lot of travel schedules, so thanks for carving out. It's probably less of a commute for you to walk down, but for you to come from where you did. But the thing that caused it all to happen, right? I mean, is it easy to say it was the smartphone, or was it, or with each incremental feature that came on to a standard old Nokia handset, was that just a precursor of things that were going to happen? So besides the historical fact, but like kind of what's going on in devices today and that linkage between operating systems and apps and handsets and network operators, because this is an ecosystem that at the same time it looks like everything's on the table. It's an ecosystem that really needs to have pretty tight linkage up and down the supply chain for pricing signals, for technology signaling, for the ability to have coordinated service product offerings together. So I'd ask each of you guys, just from your perspective, give us kind of an overview of what's going on in devices today and operating systems and apps today.
Okay. So as a quick overview, I think it was a function of many variables all happening around the same time. I think the overused expression, the tipping point, occurred when someone, in this case Apple, actually harnessed the whole ecosystem rather than just various bits that frankly until recently had competed with one another. The operator network had been referred to, in my opinion, as a dumb pipe. And to some extent, I think the global operators perceived that to be an insult rather than a compliment. And if you look at the amount of traffic that is going over the network today, recently AT&T said publicly that they had experienced a 30-fold network traffic, data traffic increase in 3 years. So
30, as in 30.
30, not double or triple or quadruple, 30-fold. And I think when you start to consider what that really means in terms of the infrastructure and what that really means in terms of the billing processes, they've got plenty to focus on, being that pipe and that capability, rather than looking at the whole environment. I think so supporting Keith's comment earlier about a 1,000-fold increase in data over a 10-year window, you can start to see that this is certainly very feasible and actually, in my view, very likely, rather than just possible. But I think what it boils down to from a consumer perspective is the consumer really doesn't care too much. The regular consumer doesn't care too much about what the device looks like or feels like. It has to be integrated and integratable into the way they work their lives, mixing both work and play. And if it does a good job of that and it does provide the things they need, then data traffic automatically follows by dramatically increased usage.
Great. I think maybe it's important to step back and recognize kind of what's behind this. And this is, I think, consumers to a great extent desire to be connected socially with other people through the computer, and also to receive content through a computing device. I think that the magic that Apple brought to the wireless market and subsequently Android was to make a transparent operating system on a mobile device that gave you access to services and content that consumers had already begun to get hooked onto through wired communications and pipes. That was really, I think, the revolutionary moment.
That was the genius moment.
That
there.
was the genius, is how do you make an operating system, and there's a lot of elements to that, both in terms of hardware and software, to give people a transparent access to these services that have become really important to their lives. And I think that the critical thing to understand here is that there's no going back. Just like there's no going back from airmail to Pony Express.
Are you saying that people don't want to go back to black and white TV today? Is that what you're saying?
They're not going back to black and white TV, and I guess in many ways we're not going back to email either. Right? Email is also declining as a form of communication.
I know.
So I think that what we as social beings in the 21st century in a developing world, which is increasing in kind of what constitutes the developing world, are changing our definition of what it means to be a social being. And that redefinition has an impact on what we need in terms of broadband connectivity. We want to be able to access people through video, through a connection to Facebook all the time, wherever we are.
So let's follow that thread for a second, because most of our conversation today has been around technology, and now we're kind of moving into the area of psychology, sociology, human interaction. So Apple and Android were able to put out a generic platform, or not, I don't mean to dump it. I use them, they're fantastic. But they've been put out a common platform that in which you could then go and choose the apps you want to interact with, when you want to interact them, and how you want to interact. If we take the discussion we just had a step further, which is, should we expect to see a Facebook branded phone, or a Facebook only phone, or a Facebook specifically designed around Facebook phone, or a Foursquare phone? Or if I think about the other social media, I mean, I live out in the Bay Area, so it's hard to keep track with every new social media startup that's going out there, but do I need a Zynga device that's optimized to Farmville? Or is that carrying too many devices around? Or do I get that by having an app on a common shared OS platform, or do I need to go application specific? I mean, it sounds like computing all over again. I guess it is computing all over again.
I think that's right. I think the precursor here is the original PC wars between Apple and Microsoft, and what we saw then is ultimately that the platform that won and the approach that won is the platform that allowed the most content, the most software to be available to consumers. So ultimately, I think that the platform, whether it winds up ultimately being iOS or Android, that gives consumers access to the most services and the most applications is the one that will win. Because ultimately, we don't know what the next Facebook will be. And one thing I can tell you for sure is the Facebook phone probably won't have that application.
That's probably fair to predict.
And just the other thing that I think is important to remember here is that from the perspective of I think the wireless carriers, it's easy to get all in a tangle and worry about these kind of short-term problems with all this data traffic that's increasing, and how do you work this out through your network and so forth. But this is a high-quality problem, right? This is the quality of the drug pusher who's given out his first dose for free, and now they're coming back at him wanting a lot more.
Could be worse than having a lot of customers.
Exactly. This is a problem that will work itself out. And one thing I think we've seen over the last 2 decades is that people want more bandwidth, and over time, they'll be paying for it. I mean, today, the average consumer in the United States pays a lot more for data than they did 20 years ago for AOL dial-up.
I think there's another factor coming into this, and that is based on the US dynamic of competition and the global competition driving adoption. The danger is that do we really know what we want next? Are we the best judges of how technology is going to be adopted and adaptable to the way we live? And I think the reality is that the very thing that has made the ecosystem so powerful for someone like Apple is potentially the fact that it is a closed environment that enables it to really have a high quality filter embedded in its architecture. I think that the danger is that as we grow, we don't know what the next Facebook is or the next email or messaging service or capability, and whether or not that falls into the category of a device. We're not in a position to judge yet. But I think there's another whole layer under here, and again back to the comments about data growth over the next 10 years. Something that I think could be worth spending time to consider is the whole M2M business. We're talking now about data traffic and the visible aspects of data traffic. To us as consumers in developed and developing countries, it's a phone, it's a smartphone. The reality is, as you start to automate other devices that the consumers are not aware of, this is a completely background system that dramatically supports the comments that Keith made about data traffic growth. When
Sure.
You're starting to look at a country like the UK, for example, that is, I believe, the most heavily security camera-based country today, and you start looking at those type of use cases, you start looking at automating utility company monitoring, remote monitoring, you start looking at even basic consumer devices like an e-book that is connecting to the network, but the consumer's really not part of that interaction, it just happens in the background.
Right.
You start to separate the market from what does the consumer see, what is the poster child for data traffic. Today it's a smartphone, tomorrow I don't think it will be. And therefore, how does that use case change the way that network infrastructure is achieved? How does it change what the smartphone in your pocket actually does and what it connects to when?
Because I think everything, that's another interesting point, which is everything we've talked about today, demand driven by the initiation of demand is always a human action. I pick up a phone, there's my human action, I dial it, I don't even dial things anymore, but or I hit it, I go to an app, or I want to check the weather, it's a human action. I initiated something that a machine responds to. Someplace, back in the cloud, back in a data center, back across somebody's long haul fiber network, somebody's metro access network, somebody's backhaul network, somebody's radio. But we all as individuals created something to occur. Whether it's an HTTP request up, little tiny file up, big download file down, or however we make the request, there's a request and a fulfill. What you're saying is that may not, what you're saying is look beyond that, right? Which is, now there's a whole bunch of things out there that are going to happen in the background that you may be contending for bandwidth with, that are out there in the network, that by virtue of, they don't have to be, because we always assume, it's interesting, we always kind of assume wireless to be synonymous with mobility. It may not be. It may be, wireless may be an access methodology even if you're fixed.
Well, I think something also to consider, especially when you look at, in terms of wireless strategy at developing countries and developing applications, you've got to remember that the infrastructure that exists in the US and in Western Europe does not exist.
Hardly anywhere else.
The legacy, the manufacturing and the maintenance of that legacy is a huge burden to the US and the European economies. And as such, when you start looking at new use cases, new business models and new ways that companies and individuals are using wireless, you've got to start to consider, okay, well, if you don't have that legacy problem, you are entering a step ahead.
Sure.
You are entering without having to manage multi-billion dollars of network infrastructure because it didn't exist. Therefore, you skip the second generation,
Sure,
the third generation, the fourth generation.
It's the proverbial clean sheet of paper, which we happen to have one right here. But if you were to start out any endeavor today and you didn't have a legacy or embedded base behind it, how would you do it? And would you do it the way you did it 5 years ago, or would you do it differently, or would you do it the way you did 10 years ago? Or do we know how to do it yet? It's really it's fascinating, because does that then say that these operating systems that live in devices today, which have been very specifically designed for devices around specific components that live in these devices, that allow those devices to have an instant on characteristic and a very high quality display and longer battery life and instant access, does it mean then that those operating systems and some apps, but more importantly the operating systems, then get transported out of the mobile device into other places? Because that's kind of the natural extension for these things, right? Which is, are we kind of getting to the point of like application-specific OS?
Well, I mean, I certainly think we'll see the proliferation of devices. I mean, think about the automobile right now is not particularly connected. I think that automobile within the next decade will be connected at least in 3 different ways. You'll have the non-human interaction part of the vehicle. We'll know about the weather conditions. We'll know about where the roads are, and we'll know about the slope of a coming hill, and we'll adjust the drivetrain accordingly. We'll take all kinds of safety considerations to make sure that there's a safer driving experience. There'll be information that comes to real time to the driver about, again, navigation, about weather, about information around him or her that will allow that driver to make better driving decisions. And then there'll be also connectivity for the passengers for infotainment. I mean, I think that the notion that 5 years from now, kids are going to be watching DVDs in the rear of the car. It's not going to happen that way. They're going to have video on demand in the car as well, and that screen is not going to be 3.5 inches like the iPhone. It's probably going to be 10 or 12 or 14 inches in the back of the car. So there's going to be a lot of sites where there's going to be demand.
Is my car going to hold a caching server with my whole Netflix library on it, or am I going to? Do you think? I mean, I'm kind of making them.
Yeah.
But do you think I'm going to? I mean, there's always this trade-off between storage, processing, and transport, right? Right. So if storage is really cheap, spread it to the edge. If bandwidth is really expensive, then centralized storage. So there's all those trade-offs because the world moves in these different things. So I guess what you're to kind of jump ahead on that one, which is, does that mean then that the way I get entertainment is I'm caching it, C-A-C-H-E, and in devices like the iPad and my MacBook Air and things like that. But is there a need to cache it if I've got a consumer cloud available and enough bandwidth to fetch and retrieve?
You're going to fetch and retrieve it, especially on portable devices such as an iPad or an iPhone, because you're not going to you have a solid-state drive where the memory is limited, and so you're simply not going to be able to store 50 or 100 movies, and you're not going to want to manage your collection in real time. You'll just go and get what you want when you want, especially when consumers have come to expect that. I mean,
yeah.
the age of broadcast is, I would argue, virtually dead. And I think that the age of even buying content and storing it is dead. People have come to expect that they'll get what they want, when they want it, and when they want it as well. The problem of how that happens becomes the problem of the network carrier.
Sure.
I think ubiquitous storage and an expectation of on-demand without exception means that there will not be a need for live programming. There will not be a need for live content. It will be in the cloud, and it won't matter where on the planet it is or how many copies there are. It will just be there when you want it and when you need it. I think what's critical for users is to know that the lowest common denominator in terms of bandwidth and capability and actually fundamental connection, which is still a huge problem in the US and rural areas, once that's addressed, then I think all these other business opportunities become much more logical
Sure.
to the mass market. I mean, when I can get a way more consistent mobile signal wandering around India or mainland China than I can wandering around 20 minutes from my house in North Carolina, then there's still a gap. And that's coming back to what I said earlier. I think you've got to also look at the on-demand cloud-based functionality that is starting to appear in some of those developing markets to see how it actually may drive adoption rates in the US and in other countries that are perceived to be developed. Because the users are looking at the use cases very different ways now. And if you're expecting on-demand content of whatever the format, you're not going to try and store it. You're not going to want to store it, and therefore you're not going to need all that home-based infrastructure.
It's interesting because watching how the last item I put down here was roadmap, and I'm not so sure that my demographic is the people to roadmap for. I mean, my daughters are the people to roadmap for, right? And so I watch them how they operate in an environment where with unlimited data plans and very fast devices and access to iTunes and YouTube and Netflix and Hulu and all these other things that were merely words that were not even in the lexicon 10 years ago, right? So now we have a whole new dictionary of things. And I think about it, it's like, wow, so my daughter's going to college here in New York, so I saw her last night. She says, oh, hey, I want to show you this new video. I'm like, cool. Oh, it's not there. Oh, no, it's not there either. And you should look like 4 sites, right? And I thought to myself, wow, all of a sudden, once again, no economic penalty or reward for making any particular choice, multiple outlets. She wanted to show me something that was about 5 minutes in length, but that she did not have. It wasn't stored on her device. She didn't have her device. She could use any device. She went to fetch it from any one of sources, and if we had longer time, we probably found more sources for it. And so when you think about how all this evolves, right? I mean, whether it's copyrighted or archived or user generated, what's going on in the content business is a whole set of operating systems and devices that are all hoping to have a tight linkage up to content, it would seem to me, as well as having to have a tight linkage down into the network, because that's how it's going to get delivered. This is how it's acquired. Here's how it's delivered, right? I just happen to be the viewing device or the storage device or the commerce device for it. And it kind of gets off to like, wow, so fundamental changes in terms of how people pay for things, right? I mean, I think some of you guys are doing some work, and Chris and I were talking about what's going on in like location-based services and near-field communications. Another hot topic. I mean, we're running out of time for hot topics because there's so many of them. But this is my wallet. This is my pay for my parking ticket, or avoid paying for my parking ticket because I have an app out there that tells me some intelligence to make it where it's free, or don't park here, or make. So the idea of that these devices connected to wireless networks become like the Swiss Army knife that people carry around for just about everything. That's kind of where Apple's going with this, right?
Right, and I think the question for Apple and for Google is, are there going to be a set of really critical services on this device that maybe are not going to be found on other devices? For example, if you look at iPods, there's one critical application there that is not transferable among other devices, and that's iTunes.
Right.
Right. And the ability of Apple to have iTunes as a proprietary system and to have had now hundreds of millions of people store their music on iTunes has made the iPod platform very sticky. So the question is, are there going to be services of that nature on the iPhone and on tablets which are going to be equally sticky for either Android or Apple? Is there going to be a Netflix that's owned by Apple down the line? And if so, if in 3 years the iTunes of video is owned by Apple, it's going to make Apple much more able of charging a premium for the iPad and making that the tablet device. If, on the other hand, most of the key services and applications are available on every platform. They're available on iOS, they're available on Android, they're available on Microsoft. It's going to be a lot harder for companies like Apple to keep the value on the hardware, and the value of that whole enterprise is going to move more towards the service providers. From the point of view of, I think what's really interesting here is that from the point of view of the people who are offering the platform today, Apple and Android, the services like video, like Facebook and so forth, are not money generators. They're actually just the means to the end.
Right.
The end for Apple is to sell you hardware and charge a premium for that. The end for Google is to have an open platform where they know they're going to have opportunity to sell you search.
Or use your usage patterns as a mechanism to populate search results.
So I was just going to say, I think that the kind of the hidden agenda here is the analytics. So ultimately, somebody's paying for this data traffic, whether it's the advertiser, whether it's retail companies, whoever it is. And I think the point here really is that the device acts as a portal for you, but it's two-way. that device and your usage of that device and your access to even more data in the cloud, your non-local storage of information means that every point that you check in with that data, it knows where you are, what you're doing, while you're doing it, and there's anonymized issues and there's privacy issues, but ultimately that device knows how you're interacting with the world around you and what transaction took place then, what did you do next, where did you go to do it?
It's your timestamp, date stamp recorder,
and
preference
I think
recorder.
coming back to the issue where in the Western world, certainly the issue has been all-you-can-eat data on a broadband. I think that model is clearly broken when it comes to wireless, but I think one of the aspects about fixing it, coming back to your Facebook phone, is where you've got a device feature and a device focus that will actually connect you to the internet in a way that either the device manufacturer, the advertiser, or the retailer will be prepared to subsidize you because of all the other data you get. Because I think, back to the comments about India and China, I think that the all-you-can-eat model is still such a hot topic. It's in the news every single day. It's like, okay, enough already. Let's get over this. The challenge is we're not going to get over it because everyone is still paying their $30-40 a month, for unlimited broadband, and I think that's where the advertising and the revenue models from the analytics really take hold.
It's really interesting because the way that would manifest itself in additional revenue streams is theoretically a higher CPM that some advertisers willing to pay, rather than I've got a highly correlated lead that has a high propensity to turn into a sale at a point of sale, rather than a banner ad that gets overlooked or clicked through or discarded. And so when you think about all that, it's like, how do I get the highest propensity or the highest probability that lead is going to turn into a sale? Because that's what people really want to pay for. That's what advertising is all about, right? Which is the reason you said earlier, broadcast is disintegrating because narrowcast gives you potentially better results, and microcast gives you potentially better results, and nanocast down to the individual level, right?
I think the answer to your question is it is not a transaction, it's a behavior.
Right.
And if you're mapping the behavior based on knowing how that device is used by not just one person but many, then you know what is the most likely outcome of a transaction, because it's part of a group of behaviors that result in a purchase.
So then we're going to see the convergence of social networking and search. I mean, I just saw something where Google came out the other day and said, we're going to basically present search results to you based on your social media preferences and the thing that you actually asked for. So kind of think of it as like a blend of Yelp and search and Facebook, or at least friends' preferences, maybe not Facebook, but not to use any branded names. But it seems to me like all with the idea that these devices now, if all this data is stored in the cloud and there's massive analytics and data mining and data warehousing going on in the background, where you could basically, under the guise of it's anonymous and there's anonymizers and it's not personal and there's no privacy laws here being violated, but build a profile that is a high probability profile to turn a sale on something. Micropayment, macro payment. Immediate, deferred. Near field communications on the device, down the road later with my app on my phone, I could click something. The Zappos model, the Amazon model, or the buy a can of Coke with my device model. And I think the answer to that is yes, right? All of them. So when we're thinking about roadmaps, right? It's about content for sure, but content helps to define what your behaviors are, right? I mean,
well, I think the comment I made earlier about overt and covert in terms of data usage, device usage, and data traffic. I think the less or the more disguised use of data, whether it be a mobile computing type environment where you've got background analytics or background utilities monitoring, things like that. This is all part of understanding how you as a consumer are interacting with the world around you. there are at least two reasons to have that data. One is because exactly from a transactional point of view, it's monitoring your electricity, it knows how much you're going to be paying. The other is to know that, okay, well, based on these behaviors, how do they manage the load? How do they manage the money? And then also, how does that then transfer into the other analytics of how you as a device user make your life work? If they know that at a certain time your device is moving at 50 miles an hour and it's heading towards your home, and you and 20 million other people are doing the same commute, it knows how to level the load of the way that you use utilities without you even being part of it. And I think this comes back to the power of that data being harnessed in positive ways.
And in real time.
And in real time.
And with high accuracy.
Right.
And based on trending.
And also, the comment you made about near-field communication, I see a lot of parallels between the micropayments model in China, India, sub-Saharan Africa, various other areas, where that really translates into what behaviors will become for macro payments. So mobile payments in developed countries are perceived as they're above a certain value.
Right.
I think if you start charting how these are already being used in other countries as the only form of payment, as the replacement to the banks, then I think that's a predictor to say, okay, well, we know what your usage is on data and voice, we know where you are, we know who your friends are, we know what your behaviors are. Now we know every financial transaction you're making.
Fascinating. Mind-boggling. And then there will probably be a time when we are thinking, how did you ever build a power plant if you couldn't level demand based on how your users used your power? How could you have ever built a highway without figuring out a flexible highway or without figuring out how how would you ever design a network? Because all these things are basic networks. It's a networked economy, whether it's for the provision of these infrastructures are all networks, and they provide some level of services to people who use them on an occasional use basis and generate demand curves. So if you think about all that, it's like we go right down to this tight linkage between devices that have to have a tight coupling to content, that have to have a tight coupling to everything that's inside the device, that has to have a tight coupling to networks. And then if you have that supply chain in place, and there's relative economics up and down, then overall, what kind of a system do you build? What kind of society do you build? How do things change from beyond where they are? Wow.
I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said that we don't know, it's our kids to decide. And I think, looking at the behavior of certainly my three daughters with tablets, there's no learning curve. I bought my daughter one of the MIT one laptop per child laptops when she was 4 years old.